Hello together. Today we are talking about converting a legacy application with API platform. And we start with a short introduction.
Yeah, hello, welcome. My name is Holger. I'm working for BitExpert since 3 years now. I did some stuff since the mid-90s, so around 28 years by now, and I'm still continue to do that stuff, but I get paid way better by now, yeah? So I guess that's an evolvement, and yeah, so.
Hi, I'm Boas. I'm not even 28 years old, so that's a good combination that we have here. And I'm also working for BitExpert for around 5 years now. Also fell in love with PHP back then, and yeah, developing PHP applications, APIs since then. Alternate title for our presentation would be The Fairy Tale of Legacyland, as we are a little bit doing a story about how we did the migration. And every good fairy tale needs some protagonists, and Holger will present them shortly.
Yeah, sure. Of course, there is Boas and myself, yeah. But we are not the only ones. We also had some fellow developers which helped us out during that quest. And every good legacy, every good story has some sidekicks. Yeah, our beloved Webby was our biggest sidekick during this conquest, and we also had to fight some villains. Yeah, and we have a big end boss to conquer to finally rescue Legacyland and moving over to Futureland.
So what is the best case scenario for us as developers? We want a green field, fresh and untouched, right? Where we can unleash our creativity and we can design everything from startup. We don't want to have incremental renovations, tweaking everything and planting flower beds. We just want to be free, right? But in Legacyland, we didn't have a green field at all. In fact, we had a lot of limitations and boundaries blocking our creativity. And we'll have a short overview about Legacyland, which Holger will give to you.
Yeah, as you can see, we have boundaries to two sides. Yeah, from our small backend application. Yeah, we have to comply to the existing consumers of the API, which is basically the front-end application and React application for that matter. And we also had on the back-end side, we had to stick to an existing database layout. We cannot change and not modify because that database layout is given by other applications in that landscape. And also the communication with the sewing machines, which the application is kind of managing. Yeah, we're doing predictive maintenance with this application, which means we try to predict when a needle has to be changed or some other maintenance has to be done. We also do measurements about efficiency of the operators of those machines. Are they too slow, maybe too fast, or whatever? Yeah, so all kinds of data we collect from those sewing machines. And yeah, we have to comply on both sides and stay compatible. And yeah, we wanted to show you how API Platform is a good tool to take this approach and conquest those villains like we did with our application, yeah. So, and then we sticked our heads together and basically thought about, okay, how do we do this approach, yeah? You can tackle different ways, yeah? You can stick with the old one, you can move on with the existing code base and do whatever, yeah? But we had a situation of this very oldish Python code base, which we are more or less in a state of a prototype, which ended up in production. And I don't know how, yeah, must be a troll, one of the villains, which took that out. And yeah, we discussed what we want to do, and as Boas said, we love a green field, and so we made a decision, yeah? Basically, we like PHP, we like Symfony, we like API Platform, and we said, okay, give it a go, yeah? If we have to touch all the code base anyway to make something good out of it, use the best tooling, right? Good. We had our decision, everything was settled, we were exciting. And then the wise people came over to us, visiting us, the wise people of Legacyland, and said, maybe it's not the best idea to do it this way because, yeah, I have rewritten a big browser and that took forever and it was a mess and a pain and don't do it. And we were, well, okay, I mean, those are wise words born out of experience. And so we sit together again, stuck our heads together again, and thought about those words and our plan. And we came out of this meeting with, yeah, a final conclusion, which, yeah, I guess you already imagined that, yeah? So we said, come on, why not doing it, yeah? Why someone said it was a bad idea doing it in his experience, why not trying it on your own, right? If you have really good reasons, move on and try it out. And that is basically what we did and where our fairy tale starts, basically.
Yeah, so in olden times, when wishing still helped, right? There was this legacy application, and this legacy application was tightly in the hands of a Python snake. And yeah, across our way, imagine there were commit messages devoid of any context, maliciously taunting you with an lol. And then we found promising setup files along the way. Alas, they were cunning traps that ensnared, revealing naught but red exceptions. You think the usual LAs like tests and documentation could help you out? They seemed to have vanished like the morning mist. The application appeared as if lost in the woods, awaiting its guiding light. And lo, a valiant PHP framework emerged, a noble hero coming to the rescue. With it came API documentation and testing tools like magical scrolls, restoring hope and promise to a tidy application. Bugs were defeated, new features bestowed, the Python snake was defeated, and we had now this charming PHP domain. However, you might recall the wise words of the owl, that a rewrite is the single most strategic mistake and one of the things that you should never do. So were there any reasons for us to actually do a rewrite? And if there were reasons, were there good reasons? Let's see.
Yeah. So from our point of view, there were several good reasons. Yeah. One point mentioned an oldish code base, which was not really that much designed. It was in the prototype state. Yeah. Everything was just functional programming. And reshaping that application into something modular, which could evolve over time, you can add new features and maintain for a long time, was one big point for us to move on with the rewrite, right? And there are also those requirements from the customer side. Yeah, they said, yeah, your application is doing great. Yeah, even in this state, but we have some ideas. Yeah, we want to go further. We want to do more with your application, move it more in the central of this whole software landscape. So having some connectors out of the box for ERP systems like SAP and so on. Yeah. And communicate directly with sewing machines, not over a database. Those are all stuff and requirements which made us convenient that we can do that better in PHP because we are PHP developers, right? And handle those for the future in the best manner we can do. And yeah, also the infrastructure and also the maintenance side. Yeah, we have a whole testing suite on hand using API platform. Yeah, out of the box, testing your APIs for compatibility with existing clients, and other tooling on the server side, which really helped us to make those decisions worthy for us. And yeah, the biggest, I would say the biggest point would be in the end of the day, if we would not do it in PHP, we wouldn't have a talk for today, right? So yeah, thanks for all for paying us, doing stuff, and finally can talk about it, yeah, because we like what we do.
Yeah, so to give you a quick overview about the application, how it looks like, and to get a little bit more into the technical details of our fairy tale. So the users that were working on the sewing machines, they would see basically some fancy, shiny information, green, everything is well, red, something is broken, some help is on the way or so. And there's also some basic admin area where they can define some sewing machine lines and get some infos and so on. But again, it's not the most complex application, or so it seems. So, for example, there was this basic statistics endpoint, nothing out of the ordinary if you look at it at first. However, there were different query parameters that you could add. For example, you could define one of the types of statistics that you want to fetch, and you had the choice between sewing statistics and product statistics. Well, the responses for those requests looked like this. So this was the sewing type response, and the product type response looked like this. So yeah, it's the same endpoint. The responses are different. They have some similarities, but they're too much different that you can use the same one, and also required and optional parameters did not match up with both responses. Okay, so another thing that is a little bit weird that you can see here is that the machine ID is also used as a key in front of the array of statistics. And well, now that I told you it's the machine ID, you know, but it could also be some coincidence that it's just now the 101 and it's maybe some other information. So it's very implicit. It's not as self-explanatory as an API document or API response as well should be. And if you want to document it, it is going to be hard. And this architecture was mostly shaped by the needs of the front end because they somehow knew what they wanted to do with it. And yeah, this whole implicity and stuff led to all of those decisions that were really hard for us to now properly document with an open API documentation. However, we needed to stay in these boundaries and we needed to stay compatible. So we had a look at what API Platform can do and how we can solve our issue with it. And we found that API Platform has the Open API Factory, which is great for extending the Open API specification to such stuff. And we extended it with a one-off scheme. We used output classes to define the different output responses. And so we could also reuse the auto-generated stuff from API Platform and didn't have to do everything manually. And yeah, here you can see this is the basic output that we created. We also added some examples, and in the end, this all turned out like this. So yeah, it's a little bit unorthodox. It isn't your usual API documentation, but it is actually correct and it is working. And that was the goal that we had in mind to create a foundation now that we can build upon. We can now expose the existing resources in a proper way and build it up alongside the existing stuff. So the existing stuff can be its legacy. It can remain how it is. But we have now all of the resources in a proper way alongside. And whenever the front end will get an update, for example, in the future, we can slowly and incrementally return to those new resources that are now proper and restful in our context. So from here you can continue in various ways as well. For example, if there's the same route that needs an update, you can also work with different accept headers for the new version, for example. So there are different approaches that you could use here. And also other talks already talked about this topic. But yeah, this is, for example, one way if you would use a different accept header. However, there was still one final boss that we needed to conquer, and that was an exe installer.
Yeah. So normally in the PHP landscape, yeah, we are used to just push out our code onto a server, nowadays Docker containers, whatever, and just run it on a server. Not in this case. The software landscape is, whoa, technical difficulties. Yep, it's working. So in our case, the application landscape is running on a plain laptop, Windows laptop, somewhere sitting in the corner of the clothing factory, yeah, where the sewing machines are placed. And running PHP there is a little bit tricky, especially if the end user is installing everything. The original, the original application had already an installer. It was rudimentary, and the technology used back then was not so completely open source, and it has the restriction that you could only build that installable exe file on a Windows machine, right? And not everyone uses Windows as a developer. We have Windows users, yeah, for sure. I mean, you see it on Boas laptop. We have Linux users, we have Mac users, right? And we have something that is called a pipeline. So we had to do something different here, and we settled on ANSYS, which conveniently comes also in a Docker image, which you can use to build your installer locally or in a pipeline, in a GitLab CI pipeline in our case. And we rewrote that complete installer from scratch and put in also new features. The original one had only ability to choose the install location. Yeah, we all know that. You can admit it, you all used Windows at some point, yeah, don't lie. And we pimped that a little bit, yeah. Also, we have this option, but also we introduced the option to be able to, at the install time, choose your MySQL username and password, which is already set up in the existing database. At least I hope so at this point. Again, end user installation, so who knows? So we did the best possible we can to ensure that at least the credentials and the database connection is ready to go after installation. And basically what we do is when we install, we use a custom installation of XAMPP, which is narrowed down, tailored down to what we need, a mobile installation bundled together with the front-end code and with the PHP back-end code, and install that during this install process on that client machine, yeah, to have everything in place, up and running. And yeah, we also introduced the feature to be able to upgrade old installations, being versions of the new rewrite or the old Python application. So we made sure when you have a version of this new installer, yeah, you can upgrade either way, no matter what was installed before. So yeah, was a little bit tricky, even almost as tricky as staying compatible to the old RPs. But yeah, we made that in the final day, and also were able to conquer those last boss, yeah, successfully.
So we revisited and we returned from our journey, and we thought again about the wise words of the wise owl. But we gave it a second thought, and we wanted to add a little bit to that quote. So there are things that you should never do unless you use API platform.
Yep.
Because if you use API platform, in the end, everything will be in a happily ever after. And yeah, and with that, there's only the question for questions, but I don't think that we have the time, officially at least, for questions. So lunch break will be soon. Yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to come to us.
We're here. We're glad to talk with you. Thanks a lot.